Well, hey there, Aletheia Church. It's Pastor Kevin, just coming with a short little video to recap my sermon from First Corinthians chapter 9, at least the first half of the chapter, where Paul talks a lot about surrendering his rights and his freedoms for the sake of the gospel. And one of the things I mentioned in my sermon was that we need to understand what Paul is saying in chapter 9 in light of what Pastor Theo taught us in chapter 8, which was this issue that was creating disunity inside of the church over the issue of whether it was okay to eat the meat that had been sacrificed to idols and then later served in the market. And so Paul's kind of point is that although knowledge dictates to us that we are free to eat that meat, that he chose not to for the sake of the weaker brothers and sisters around him who did not think that it was okay. And so what kind of got created out of that, though, because the Corinthians were familiar with his arguments and what Paul was saying in regards to not eating that meat, is some within the Corinthian church then began to say that Paul didn't understand the gospel, that Paul wasn't really an apostle, and that you shouldn't listen to him. And so what we see then in chapter 9 is Paul talk about this idea as believers of laying down our rights and our preferences for the sake of gospel witness, for the sake of being able to share the good news of what Jesus has done with others. And I said on Sunday morning that this should be something that is likely probably going to be something we really need to wrestle with, especially as Americans, because Americans often treat freedom as one of the chief virtues of our culture, where we believe that we should be allowed to do whatever it is we want to do so long as it doesn't harm someone else physically or emotionally. And sometimes even we wrestle with the definition of what that may be, but really in reality, kind of as Americans, that tends to be how we operate. As someone who is even a card-carrying libertarian, that tends to be what I believe from a political perspective. But Paul's going to present to us a different approach in chapter 9 here of First Corinthians, where he's going to say Christians should be willing to lay down our rights and preferences for the sake of other Christians, that our example should be to lay down our preferences and our rights for the opportunity to display and share the gospel with others. And so he starts off by kind of just giving a list of questions to the readers, saying, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus? Did God not use me in your life? Basically, Paul's saying is, hey, I'm just as free as you are. I am an apostle. I have seen the resurrected Christ, and God used me to lead many of you to faith in Christ. So if anyone has the right to exercise his freedoms, it's me. And then he's going to mention what those freedoms are. And those freedoms would be whether he was allowed to eat or drink or not, whether he was allowed to marry or not, like many of the other apostles and pastors had. And lastly, and this is going to be his big example, on whether or not he had the right to take a salary from the church. And I went in depth during my sermon on Paul's argument on whether pastors and apostles were allowed to take a salary from the church or not. So I'm not going to go into depth on that. But Paul's point is that from a common sense perspective and from a biblical perspective, those that derive their work from the work of the ministry full time should have the right to take a salary. But Paul's greater point is although he had the right to take a salary from the church in Corinth, he chose not to. And he chose not to for one very specific reason. He felt that it was culturally appropriate for him to work vocationally as a tent maker so as to unencumber himself and unencumber the church with the need to pay him a salary, and instead just preach the gospel and plant this church free of charge. So ultimately he's saying he surrendered his rights to a salary for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of witnessing to the church at Corinth. And instead, he receives a reward, and that reward is in Christ. is their belief in the gospel, their shared inheritance in Christ. See, Paul believed that one day in heaven, he was going to look around and he was going to see others that he had led to Christ and that he had preached the gospel to, and that laying down of this right to receive a salary was going to seem like nothing in light of seeing other people who had come to Christ because of his faithfulness. And so the question I kind of posed into the church and I want to pose to you in group is there disunity among us? Is there disunity amongst other believers? And is there disunity amongst the church? And if so, might we follow the pattern of Paul and of Christ, where we'd be willing to lay down our rights for the sake of the gospel? I hope you guys will spend some time talking through some practical implications of what those rights might be this evening, and how we might lay those down together and see a greater worship of Jesus. Church, I'm praying for you. I love you. Have a great week. Go and be the church.